Welcome to the Psych Soul podcast, where we summon the God within to discover how we can live epic through psychedelic integration. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited about today's interview with someone who I believe is erring on the side of eldership in the field. Don't shoot me for that. He has been around for a long time, researching one of the most expansive entheogens known to humankind, and creating avant-garde pathways that many current leaders in the psychedelic field are cruising through as we speak, literally in large thanks to his pioneering work. He is also somewhat of a radical persona that has stirred many a tea in the psychedelic space. I personally appreciate radical people, and therefore I'm so grateful to have him here with us today to help us stir the cauldron that is the Psych Soul podcast. Just a disclaimer, this podcast, as usual, is for educational purposes only and does not in any way, shape, or form condone the use of illicit substances or partaking in any illegal activities. If you do decide to make the choice to engage with powerful psychedelics and plant medicines, please do so mindfully. Martin Ball, PhD, is a pioneer in the field of non-duality, entheogenic energetics, and 5-MeO-DMT. He is an independent author and publisher of over 20 books on these topics and is considered to be one of the leading authorities in the world on the 5-MeO-DMT experience. Martin is also a non-dual entheogenic integration coach, specializing in helping clients integrate the surprising energetics of 5-MeO-DMT. And he's also a prolific musician, visionary artist, and photographer. I can attest to that because we're friends on Facebook and I, follow his work. And yes, so beautiful. And all his works expound on the overarching views he's defined as the entheological paradigm. Welcome, Martin. What is the entheological paradigm?
Well, thanks for having me, Shiri, and thanks for asking.
Expound on the overarching views he's defined as the entheological paradigm. Welcome, Martin. What is the entheological paradigm?
Well, thanks for having me, Shiri, and thanks for asking. So the entheological paradigm is the name that I came up with to kind of describe or encapsulate what it was that I was trying to communicate with the world. This comes on the heels of my personal deeply transformative work with 5-MeO-DMT, also working with ayahuasca and some other psychedelic medicines, but this was back in 2008 and 2009. And during this time period was a deeply transformative time period for me. And through that, I went from being what I would describe as a philosophical non-dualist to what I was describing as now a radical or embodied non-dualist. From this position of, look, these are experiences that I've now had directly for myself, and it has really shaped and informed my view of reality. And in coming through that, some of the things I previously believed, I felt that I confirmed. Then there was a lot of things that I maybe believed or was interested in or thought was possible, and then kind of came out with like, actually, I don't agree with these propositions about the nature of reality anymore. So, ever since then, it was this in the spring of 2009 when I really reached this what I call a point of completion of this point of transformation, that I've been trying to articulate this view of what is a non-dual approach to working with psychedelics. How does that apply to our understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of being? And the very first book that I wrote on that subject, I can grab it. I've got my stack over here. Was I'll put it in the picture. Is this one, Being Human, an Entheological Guide to God, Evolution, and the Fractal Energetic Nature of Reality. And you can see it's a nice little thin book. But this was
I'm smiling because, sorry to interrupt you, is that when I was a student in psychology school studying to be a psychedelic therapist, I found this book online. And of course, I purchased it, not knowing who you were. So this is how I got introduced to your work, through this exact book.
Awesome. Well, for many years, this was my best-selling book, and it's short, but it's really, I was trying to distill just in very basic terminology, like what is this understanding that really there's only one being in consciousness, that is a being that is made of the energy of unconditional love that through fractal permutations divides itself into multiple forms simultaneously and is interacting with itself through embodied forms, which I like to call vehicles. So like you and I, we are vehicles for this universal consciousness and being, which I just like to use the word God. And I also distinguish that this is not the God of any religion. This is not mythological construct. This is the nature of being. This is the nature of reality. So I've been busy articulating this view of the entheological paradigm, and I first put it into text here in, get it in the picture, Being Human. And so entheological means, theology obviously is the quote unquote logic of God or an understanding of God. Entheological means God within, and then paradigm means like exemplary model or model for understanding the nature of reality. So it's trying to articulate this view that is different than you're really going to find anywhere else. And so that's why I've been radical, because I've been very outspoken about this, and that it's not merely a theoretical construct for me. It's a lived reality, and it applies directly to how we might choose to work with various psychedelics and entheogens. And so that's why, these days I call myself a non-dual entheogenic educator. I don't use the term entheological paradigm too much. I do have a book by that name, but that's really where that comes from. And it was from my own personal experience in trying to articulate, okay, I now have a view that is different than I think anybody else in the psychedelic world is articulating. It's definitely different than anything I've seen coming out of any traditional religion or non-dual philosophy. So I sort of took that on as, well, I guess that's my mission, is I'm going to try and communicate this as best I can. And that's what I've been doing.
Certainly. And then, of course, as a radical, then you would know that, attempting to communicate any novel ideas or things that kind of put a stick in somebody else's wheel because they just align with other paradigms. This can be quite an undertaking, and you've been through this.
Yes, I've been through several different permutations of this, and I understand that it can be challenging. That I am very strong in my views. That a lot of people like to present their views and say, "Well, this is what I think," or "This is what I feel," and again, coming from my own direct experience, that I tend to articulate things by saying, "This is the way it is. This is my experience. Here's how it works," and I'm just going to be really blunt about that. And again, in arriving at this view, I want to emphasize that a lot of it was very surprising for me, where then in looking at various data sets of people's experiences or people's theories or people's ideas, really realizing like, I don't agree with what these people are saying. I don't agree with their view. I don't agree with their sharing with others about the nature of reality. And I haven't been shy about sharing that. So like back when I wrote Being Human and was discussing all of this on my podcast, I was getting emails from people saying, just across the spectrum of, I think you're possessed. You're the Antichrist. You're a fraud. You're a charlatan. You're some kind of weird guru, which I've never been a guru in any way, shape, or form. So that was all the way back in like 2008 and 2009. And yeah, I've continued to express rather strong views and really share very intimate details about what this actually looks like, quote unquote, on the ground in entheogenic sessions and things like that. And so I have been viewed as something of an iconoclast. People have called me controversial. I've been called all kinds of names, and I've also had my work like really highly distorted for non-generous purposes, I would say. And throughout it all, as you can see, I'm just a guy. I do my thing, but I definitely have had to live with a lot of different labels that people have wanted to put on me. But I try and be helpful as best I can in sharing this information and assisting people in their process.
So how can facilitators and guides and coaches that are, again, engaging in groundbreaking work, working with medicines in new ways, responding directly to their clients, right? Really facilitating life-changing transformations. confidently share these, what some people can, construe as radical ideas? How can people do so confidently, knowing that there are other people in the field that are kind of trying to gatekeep everything? That's what it seems like to me,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think that that's ultimately the question that doesn't really have like a satisfactory answer. Um, in my own experience, I've been very open, very forthcoming, and tried to share a wide variety of material through a wide variety of formats, right? You've mentioned that I write books. I've got my books. I've got my podcast that I've been doing for 16 years where I've been articulating all of this. I've written articles. I've spoken at conferences. I've shared all this information. And yet there are wannabe gatekeepers out there who want to come in and pretty much just bash everything and try and characterize it in a way that's very disingenuous. And so I don't know if there really is room for people to take something that might be considered just very radical or unconventional or not within the norm. I mean, especially as we are now moving into the era of quote unquote legal psychedelic therapy, there's lots of conversations about what are the ethical guidelines and what are the training programs. And, honestly, it's a really ironic situation. Like I have an interview that's going to be coming out on my podcast in another couple of weeks where I just interviewed someone here in Oregon who went through the psilocybin assisted services training program. And honestly, it's a horror story of what he's sharing, and that people who are teaching the facilitators, he went to one school where the people teaching facilitators how to work with psilocybin had no experience with psilocybin. I mean, it's crazy. Like, how is that even possible? So we have a lot of people who are claiming authority, claiming expertise, but I don't know if they necessarily have it. And so that someone like myself who has abundant experience and again, worked in ways that are completely unconventional, that, I pioneered. I can't even say pioneered because I was the only person doing it, that I was working in a specific modality that I was referring to as being non-dual energetic therapy or non-dual energetic work, working with 5-MeO DMT and also other psychedelics and entheogens. But it was a practice that developed through me and through my own experience. There wasn't anyone else on the planet who was working this way. And it was very, very unique. And it was something that my clients routinely returned to me to experience and work with. And I even had a couple clients, I've shared this quote a few times, but it struck me that I had two different clients say the same thing, which surprised me. But it was people who had done entheogenic work with other facilitators and then worked with me. And these two different clients on completely different dates that these people didn't even know each other said their other experiences of working with people was like kindergarten versus going to graduate school working with me. And I kind of agreed with him. Like, this is very advanced work, but there wasn't anybody else on the planet doing it. So then when I've shared about it, people either say, wow, this is really interesting. I want to know more. I'm really curious about this. Or people say, what? I don't understand this. And so getting into that, like, where is there room for people to share about things that might be really unconventional, might not fit with people's preconceived notions about how they think should be, that there's just not a lot of space for it really to be discussed in the psychedelic world. So what we're kind of dancing around is that it was 2021 now, it's like 3 years ago, where Symposia did this takedown of me, which was, I have even outlined, here are all the ways that they have violated all the ethical norms of what is supposed to be considered journalism or investigative journalism. And they just across the board, they violated all of it. And since then, you're probably only the second person who has even been willing to have me on their show and even talk about me or my work in any way. So there's been, there's been some blacklisting that's taken place there. And even when people have tried to organize space for me to talk about it, then kind of a reactionary contingent within culture comes in and says, oh no, Martin Ball, he's that freaky guy. You can't even talk to him. But I'm pretty easy to talk to, I think.
I remember sitting in that room at the time and myself having a very strong reaction to what was coming up in the room, to a point where I literally got up and left.
Yeah.
And I remember just like exploring that within myself at the time. I was very new to psychedelic work, to be fair. It was only like 2 or 3 years in the field. This was like 2016, I think 17 maybe. And, I couldn't understand it, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't understand, I think what you were attempting to teach, I felt like there was like very strong ego in the room, which, to be fair, I feel like a lot of people that do work with five kind of just have that side of them very much developed. Okay. But this is just a side note. However, I want to say that even with my strong reaction, when that whole thing with that organization came out, I was just stunned with the cheap way that they basically try to take you down and cancel you. Like, as far as I saw, I felt like there were people canceling a human being. And I was not okay with that. I think you can disagree with a person. I think you can critique a person. I think you can offer constructive feedback to a person. But to come out and publicly shame and cancel and literally try to take down a person, I feel like this is exactly the opposite of what the way that I see psychedelic work is about. It's about learning to create restorative justice and learning to make space for different opinions, methods, magic, things that maybe are not yet proven by science, but we know we're psychedelic people. We know how these compounds work. We are literally seeing like things that I've never seen before, as mentioned. And so how can we make room for more diversity, for more voices, for novel ways of working with medicine, and just accepting that we don't know everything and we can't in any way try to minimize another person's experience to a point where, we're violating in person in this way.
I feel the same way. And I don't really have a solution that, like, I think it was about a year ago now that I put out another podcast that I called My Scarlet Letter, of living with the aftermath of Symposia's unethical journalistic abuse. And on that, I said, in the podcast, like, well, if the psychedelic world wants to just have cancel culture, wants to have sensationalized takedown approach to people that they might disagree with, or that maybe that they don't understand and are not even willing to get into a conversation with. I said, I don't think that really bodes very well for the psychedelic movement in general. Doesn't speak very well for us as a culture, as a community, and really muddies the waters when there are definitely problematic facilitators out there.
And the fact that specifically with 5-MeO-DMT, there have been facilitators that really tend to rock the boat quite a lot with their quote unquote innovative methods. And harm is definitely being caused. Wouldn't you agree? So how can we balance this conversation about, again, doing this work, inviting new ways, while also making sure that participants are kept safe?
Well, I think one of the ways of doing that is developing quote unquote community around it and having people involved in community. This is one of the things that was definitely lacking back when I was actively working with clients. There was no quote unquote 5-MeO-DMT community, for one. For the majority of the time that I was working, I knew one other person who facilitated with 5-MeO-DMT, and that was the person who initially initiated me into the experience. And it wasn't until around the time that I was finishing, that I retired from actively facilitating with 5-MeO and doing this non-dual energetic therapy, or non-dual energetic work, way back in 2016. And it was 1 year later when the World Bufo Various Congress first met, and also the formation of what has now become called the Conclave first met. And that was like the first attempt to sort of build some kind of 5-MeO DMT community where there can be the sharing of information, sharing of what works, what doesn't work, develop of standards and things like that. And I think that that's something that's really useful. But still, you're going to have rogue people out there doing their thing. And I think maybe there is room for investigative journalism that's done, in a good way, that's done in a way that actually adheres to the ethical standards of what investigative journalism is supposed to be. And there's a lot of performative moralizing that goes on. And it only seems to be exacerbated within the past few years. It's just let's get rid of the things that make us uncomfortable and let's label people, and we're going to put everybody into a camp of whether you are a groomer or an abuser or whatever label they want to use for people. And psychedelic culture has largely gone along with it, or the psychedelic community, because most people are not interested in giving me the space to even have a conversation.
Yeah. And, on the integration, as an integration researcher, this I feel is exactly the opposite of integration, right? When psychedelics are utilized, there is an amplification of internal conflicts that then get projected onto the community as a container. And basically it begins splitting the community. And the whole idea of psychedelic integration is learning to accept reality as it is, acknowledging all reality as true in the fact that it exists. This is just part of reality. And then learn to accept that reality is part of our lives in this way. I mean, you don't have to subscribe to it. You don't have to become part of it. But disowning it is really again, it causes more splitting and less integration, less healing. Anytime that we disown something and cancel it or bury it or try to hide it or try to, again, shame it. I mean, shame is so incredibly toxic. So it basically causes more rapture in our community and our society. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on that. But I really want to know, okay, since this is an integration show, how do you employ non-duality and energetics as part of your integration model?
Okay, well, that's definitely something I can talk a lot about. So I'll try and put it into a nutshell. Okay, so non-duality. So I really start from the position that there is only one being in consciousness. And I like to use those two terms, both being and consciousness, because being for me includes both physical reality, emotional reality, mental reality, right? That this is all part of this one thing. And I don't want to overemphasize consciousness, because a lot of traditional non-dual teachings and philosophy have really emphasized the consciousness part of things, even to the extent of saying only consciousness is real. All of the physical reality that we experience is actually all just an illusion. None of it's real. So I like to say that there's only one consciousness and being that has all of these multiple aspects to it: physicality, emotionality, intellectual, mental events. All of this is all one. So it's kind of starting from that position that we have this non-dual nature of being, that there's only one being that is interacting with itself across multiple levels simultaneously, that this is actually what's happening within psychedelic experiences, that it's the self interacting with the self. Now, most apprehensions of the self are through what we call duality, meaning that there's a separation between subject and object. So here, I am separate from my microphone, I'm separate from the computer, I'm separate from you, and that we have the physical body, and with the personality construct that we identify as Martin is associated over here with this thing. But that's true, but that's not all that I am, because the being and consciousness that makes me is also everything else, everywhere, all the time. So there really is only one being that's interacting with itself. So in most psychedelic experiences, then what we're getting is that the self is interacting with the self across multiple levels simultaneously, where we might be having a vision of, say, ancestors or spirits or myself as a child or my parents or whatever issue arises within that psychedelic space. But these are filtered through the construct of the ego. So the ego is a collection of patterns of energy with which we identify this as, well, this is me. I'm identifying as this person who has these thoughts, these feelings, this history, this past, this experience, and that self-awareness we have around that. That is the ego. And the ego always creates itself in context of otherness, because the ego only exists when it says, well, this is me, everything else is not me, right? So that's duality. But with 5-MeO-DMT, so this is where my own non-duality comes from, is that we have the potential to completely override the energetic constructs of the ego so that the individual can pass into a state of non-dual awareness. And also an embodied non-dual state. I also like to emphasize this as well. There's lots of different aspects to this, so I'm trying to be brief. But the idea is that really what we're doing with our psychedelic work is we are either, in some cases, moving into a non-dual state where we are experiencing the infinite nature of the nature of the self, or we are working through some kind of dualistic constructs. And I tend to emphasize the non-dual side of things because I say, well, this is the most direct route to really resolving whatever might be going on within your ego. And that it tends to be faster, it tends to be deeper, it tends to be more transformative. But we need to look at the energetics of all of this. So something that I distinguished very, very early on and have been harping on ever since is that for the most part, the ego is embodied through various forms of asymmetries. And actually this takes place at both the physical form and at the interior level, where we divide things into, I like this, I don't like that. I believe this, I don't believe that. I want this, I don't want that. I identify on this side, not on this side. And so we set up all these oppositional categories within ourselves and within the way that we think about things and the way that we allow ourselves to feel or express ourselves. So we adopt a lot of these structures from family, culture, society, religion, and that in many cases, what we do is we create these energetic patterns that are not really in alignment with what I would call our authentic self or our authentic expression. Where, how do we know if something is authentic? Well, that comes from a place of unconditional self-love, you know. That's a good starting point. Because again, there's only one being interacting with itself, and it loves itself, and it doesn't pick sides, and it doesn't divide things into right or wrong or good or bad, because it just is. It just is, and it expresses itself as it is. But as human beings, we're constantly self-monitoring, and we're self-editing, and we're judging, and we're trying to put ourselves into the category of, well, do I think I'm good or do I think I'm bad? And then we're using other people's opinions to try and put ourselves into those categories as well. Anyway. And again, it all tends to be embodied through these asymmetries, and meaning that there's not just an open balance there. But something that I learned early on with 5-MeO-DMT is that when people do go into a non-dual state where they transcend beyond the energetic confines of the ego, that their bodies tend to display bilateral symmetry. In other words, there's this openness that shows up in people's bodies, and it's very spontaneous. It's just something that happens. And even there can be periods where people are engaged in various forms of bilaterally symmetrical movements that take place. And it's always very fascinating because these movements take place, and afterwards the ego will return, and the ego most often doesn't know that the person was just doing these movements, because the ego is very different than just fundamental awareness. So these are all just little snippets of all of it, but I like to use this as a basis for helping people understand. So let's put it into really practical levels. Okay, so someone says, well, I took 5-MeO-DMT, and then I went into a period that I don't have any recall of, and the people who were facilitating for me tell me that I was lying down and that I was moving in these symmetrical movements, or maybe I was just lying perfectly still and I don't know what was going on. And then at some point my ego came back, and then all of a sudden I started feeling nauseous, and I was twisting from side to side, and I was fighting with it. It's a way of looking at then, okay, how are you energetically moving through that experience? And where is your ego acting out? Where is it trying to control or manage the experience? So that's just a very general view of that. But we can also take someone's more dualistic experience. Like, for example, if somebody says, well, I was having this vision of my mother and the abuse that I suffered, or her lack of love for me, and that, I ended up curling up into a ball and into a fetal position. So I'm looking at all of these ways that not only what people are experiencing, but what they're allowing, what they're expressing, how their embodiment is passing through these different states. So this is all data that I like to take in for then how can we help you understand what's going on with your experience and where you might be limiting yourself in various ways through beliefs that you've adopted through your experience of being human, and helping people find greater levels of just authentic freedom within themselves to really fully be themselves. And I really like to emphasize that this is a process, and it does entail learning how to work with these energies, how to surrender with these energies, and that psychedelics are these great tools to amplify our energetic states, to kind of reveal, here's all the places where I'm twisted up and I'm bent out of shape, or I'm disconnected from myself, or here's where I'm really allowing and really in alignment with myself. So I like to refer to it as a process of energetic recalibration. And again, it's all framed within this process of non-dual experience and realization that I do emphasize the non-dual, that I do like to say that, look, once you go into the non-dual, it puts all of your dualist experiences into perspective. And you can't really have that perspective without having a non-dual experience. So I do see it as fundamental and as more primary than more dualistic manifestations of psychedelic consciousness and awareness. And this was another place where early on, as I was communicating this on my podcast, people were just like, who the fuck do you think you are to tell us this kind of thing? Like, come on. It's like, well, this is based on my experience. Like, this really is my experience. And I want to communicate why it's so important. But people didn't always like that. Because, I would give examples and I would say, look, so this is one of my classic examples that Terence McKenna was always going off about smoking DMT and then getting in contact with these machine elves. And he would just spend hours and hours discoursing on what is the nature of these machine elves and what are they doing? And then he dovetailed it into his whole theories of there's going to be some kind of fundamental transformation that happens at the end of 2012 because these machine elves, that they sing objects into reality. And so on December 21st of 2012, we are going to start singing UFOs made out of translinguistic matter into existence. And we're going to fly off into the cosmos and we're going to join our alien brethren. And I had to come back with this is all 100% a projection of Terence McKenna's ego. None of this is real. This has nothing to do with the nature of reality. It only has to do with how does the ego work. So we can use this as an example to understand how the ego gets us into projected states of self and other and making of meaning and all of that. But from the non-dual perspective, all of this is just Terence McKenna's ego interacting with itself and creating a narrative and story that gives him a sense of identity and purpose. But it's just the game of the ego. Then if we go into the non-dual, then we can see all of this very clearly. Oh, this is how the ego works. This is how it creates meaning. It creates the sense of self and other. It creates stories. So I'm always trying to help people go into that non-dual space and really appreciate their experience from there rather than attaching to the projections that arise and the meaning making that we want to create around all of that. And sometimes, and going back to the symposia stuff, sometimes this stuff is processed in the body in really dramatic ways. And it's not always clean. And it's definitely not according to any idea of how things should or should not be. And that's every time we're in the area of how things should or should not be, we are coming from an egoic perspective that says, I have certain values and ideas and beliefs, and anybody who violates those or doesn't uphold those, they're wrong, right? Because the ego is always creating oppositional categories. So trying to give space for really radical liberation experiences within people that are not coming from these categories, but are coming from the more immediacy of the energetic reality that they're experiencing. So that's a big mouthful of a lot of words and a lot of ideas, but I'm trying to be short. See, this
No,
thing.
and it is, and it's actually such an incredible articulation of the space that is facilitated by 5-MeO DMT. And then arguably, like, we're literally talking about this substance that I feel is probably, for at least for like from what I've seen, is more challenging to integrate than others because it is so fast and so ineffable. So what are some practical down-home integration tools that you can share with the average listener that maybe has partaken with 5-MeO DMT?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to 5-MeO DMT, I definitely am a proponent of educate yourself first before taking it. That I think it's very problematic when people kind of take the approach of, oh, it's another psychedelic. And I've tried lots of psychedelics, whatever it may be. Or I hear that this one's fast and, people have great things to say about it. And first, I do like to say that you need to educate yourself about it because 5-MeO DMT is so radical and so powerful that you are going to be going through it afterwards, no matter what your experience was. So at one level, we have this phenomenon of what has come to be called the ontological shock, meaning that people think they have an idea of what they think reality is, whatever that may be, and then they take 5-MeO DMT and all of a sudden they're like, oh man, whatever my beliefs were before, that I don't know what to think of them anymore. So ontology is the area of philosophy and science that deals with what is the nature of being, what is the nature of what is. And so people go through this ontological shock, and there might be an adjustment period around that. Also that 5-MeO DMT is the most energetically potent of any psychedelic, and not even just any psychedelic, but it's the most energetically potent experience that I think the human vehicle, the human body can experience and process. It is just so far beyond whatever you think your highest energetic capacity could be. Then you take 5-MeO and it's like infinitely beyond that. So knowing that in going through this massive energetic event, that there are going to be after effects is something that's very, very important to understand. Meaning, so the word that gets used these days is reactivations. That was coined by my friend Hal, because way back in 2008, after my second 5-MeO DMT experience, the very next day I was sitting meditating. And at the very beginning of the meditation, I just thought, oh, I could take this all the way. And I went into a 5-MeO experience. And I called up my friend Hal and I said, hey, it just happened. I had like this spontaneous endogenous release of 5-MeO DMT. And it was indistinguishable from having just taken the molecule. And this was the beginnings of the public knowledge around reactivations, because I talked about it also on my podcast. And so Hal said, well, spontaneous endogenous release of 5-MeO DMT is like, that's way too wordy. So we'll just call it reactivations. And that's now the language that has been adopted kind of globally around that. This is also around the same time that I started calling it the God molecule. And just even there, just using the word God, like back in 2008, it pissed people off in the psychedelic community. And no one wanted to hear that word at all. And I was like, how dare you call this the God molecule? This is even using that word, like call it source or call it the universe or call it Buddha mind, but don't call it God. And like, no, like, don't tell me what words to use. That was kind of my response. Anyway, so there's going to be lots of ongoing energetic reactivations that happen after taking 5-MeO DMT. This is one of the most important things for people to realize. And that I always recommend whenever these things occur, whether it's when you're trying to go to sleep at night, which is a common time period, whether it's 3 a.m., which is another common time period when it happens, or when you're meditating, or when you're dancing, or when you're making love, or when you might just be going through a walk through the forest and all of a sudden it's like happening. I always tell people, treat it as though you just took a hit of 5-MeO DMT or you just smoked some bufo. In other words, use the energetic formatting that I have described in abundant detail in my books and in my talks about how, okay, go into a neutral position where you're assuming bilateral symmetry within the body, because if you're bunched up or if you're asymmetrical or side to side, you're already engaging the energetic structures of the ego. What we want to do is make it have as little resistance from the ego as possible. So you go into a bilaterally symmetrical open position. You allow yourself to process the energy, which means you might need to scream, cry, laugh, purge. You might need to engage in a lot of movement in order to fully embody that, but we want to do it really authentically. And also with the energies that arise with 5-MeO DMT, it's really common for people to need to experience and express energies that do not have any particular personal identification or content. So this is what's really, really different with 5-MeO DMT. So for example, somebody's in a therapy session with MDMA and they're like, oh, I'm processing all my PTSD and I'm kind of reliving those traumatic events and I'm releasing my energies around that. With 5-MeO DMT, most often these kinds of processes don't come with a personal narrative because we're dealing with the non-dual state of being. So it's not identified through the ego. So someone might say, I just feel like I need to cry for like the next month and I have no idea why. And that's where the advice is, okay, well, let yourself do it, but make sure you're doing it in an open symmetrical position. And that allows that energy to move through more cleanly and more clearly. Also with integrating 5-MeO, it's really common that people do move through periods where they don't have any egoic memory or awareness of what took place during their event. And this is where it's really good to gather that data, talk to the people that facilitated to you or who might have been present for your session. And I even recommend that people video record their sessions with 5-MeO because it's so common for people to move through a period that they don't have active recall or awareness of. But then in getting those details, we can start to see, well, maybe you were just lying there and nothing was happening. Or maybe a whole bunch of stuff was happening that you don't know of. So I also like to distinguish that there's the conscious part of the ego, which can go offline. And then unconscious patterns of the ego then start to act out within the experience. And they might have certain levels of resistance or certain levels of projection. So it actually does take kind of reviewing someone's 5-MeO experience in a lot of detail to help them understand what was taking place. And especially then when we get lots of details about their life, about their history, about their choices, about where they feel authentic, where they feel that they are, quote unquote, living a lie, not living authentically, that we can start to see how this is manifesting within the 5-MeO experience itself and also in the after effects that they're experiencing afterwards. So all of this is relevant, that there's so much information that we really do need here in order to really help people. But it does come back to the simplest is the non-dual nature of being is embodied through bilateral symmetry that is open. And if there are movements that take place, they tend to be fluid, symmetrical movements. The ego is most often embodied through asymmetries. And when we are processing the energies of 5-MeO DMT, what we want to do is go into a symmetrical position and process from there for as long as it takes in order for that energy to reach a point of completion. And that I use this term of energetic recalibration is what's going to take place as soon as you introduce 5-MeO DMT into your system. And then this is my theory, we don't have scientific data on this yet, but we do know that the human body produces 5-MeO DMT. But most of us don't have a 5-MeO DMT experience until we have it introduced from outside. And it seems like that sort of primes the pump within the body to look, okay, now we can produce more, and now we know what to do with it. And that this starts happening for people. So I like to tell people, like, if you don't want to confront all the truths about yourself, don't take 5-MeO DMT. If you want to work with psychedelics, do something else, because you can bullshit yourself pretty easily with other psychedelics, but with 5-MeO,
True.
you're not really going to be able to do it, or at least it's going to be really, really uncomfortable if you do. And that it does open up this process of energetic reformatting. So really understanding that it's a process, and that there are insights and personal narratives that arise within it. But this also is where 5-MeO is largely very different from other psychedelics, that so much of it feels afterwards. People describe something else took me over, this energy took me over, and this stuff just started happening, which is really different than going through a psilocybin therapy session or an MDMA session and then having material to work with and think about and process later, and to identify, oh, this is how this applies to my life. Whereas 5-MeO is, you have just now entered the cosmic washing machine. And you know what? Even though you're out of your session with 5-MeO, you're still in the rinse and repeat cycle. And this is going to keep going. It might be going for a couple months now. So it's a very, very different process. And it's just this raw experience of energy. And then people start to go into non-dual states outside of the 5-MeO experience. And that can be terrifying for people. They say, I was walking down the street and all of a sudden reality was dissolving and everything was becoming one. Or another one, like actually I've been in conversation with this fellow. He says that, well, now every time I look at my brother, I only see myself. And like, I'm really uncomfortable with that because I want my brother to come back. But his ego is trying to grapple with the fact that this non-dual experience does open us up to this reality that actually everything is just me, but not the ego me. It's the fundamental me. So just to wrap that up, because I know you asked at the practical level, that's also why I wrote this book. This is the new book, 5-MeO DMT Integration, Embodying Non-Duality is Not What You Think, Education and Empowerment for Working with the God Molecule. So this is my newest book that kind of lays out, here's just the practical advice. And I wrote it not only for people who are looking to integrate their 5-MeO DMT experience, but also for people who want to serve as an integration coach for people with 5-MeO DMT experiences, because I do make the argument in the book that, well, if you're a psychedelic integration coach, but if you're not intimately familiar with how 5-MeO DMT works and what happens and what kind of after effects people get, you're not going to be able to help them. And also, you really do need to have an understanding of non-duality, because that's what people are experiencing on 5-MeO. So if you don't have an understanding of non-duality, that the claims that people make from 5-MeO are just going to sound egoically grandiose. If somebody says, well, I experienced I was God, a standard therapist would say, whoa, okay, well, let's bring that back down. But, that's just the reality of the situation. That's what people experience. So we need to understand all of these things. And I always do try and make things very practical and very accessible. Yeah, you got a bug?
I had a black wasp crawling in my face. Speaking of the nature of reality. And yes, I just want to wrap that up by saying, well, again, thank you so much for this articulation of what can be such a grand and ineffable experience. And I can't wait to read this book personally. And thank you so much for putting that out there. Very much needed.
Yeah, well, it was a pleasure to write it. Actually, I started writing it while I was at home with COVID and just kind of figuring like, well, this would be a good book to write that I think people could use this information. Because I was contemplating like, do I want to teach a class on this or something? I was like, well, I'll write a book. So I started that when I had COVID. It was in January 12th, I think that I started writing the book. And then I put that out and just completed the audiobook, and now the audiobook is out as of like yesterday. The audiobook is now available. So now it's available in audiobook, ebook, and paperback. And that's one of the joys of being an independent author and publisher, is that I can just work at my own schedule, at my own pace, and just do my own thing and design my own books. And then for the book itself, I include my own art and photography because I like doing that. And for the audiobook, I recorded a new album of music to go with the audiobook. And because I like doing multi-pronged artistic creative ventures. So
that's incredible. That's a true multidisciplinary psychedelic artist.
Yeah. I'm a Renaissance man. What can I say?
Yes. I love it. Thank you so much. So we always conclude with a rapid fire round of 5 epic facts about our guests. Are you ready to play?
Okay, yeah. Game time.
Okay. Game time. Let's go. What's your favorite psychedelic?
Oh man, well, I guess it's 5-MeO. I guess, but I like other ones for other purposes too. So for absolute power and clarity, 5-MeO, without a doubt. For listening to music, MDMA, without a doubt. Like music never sounds as good as it does on MDMA.
Really? I contest. Mine is LSD for music, but this is your rapid fire. Yeah.
I've never experienced LSD other than like half a tab many, many years ago. So I can't comment on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe in the next lifetime. Seems like in this one you're pretty soaked already. What's your favorite thing to do after a ceremony?
Well, I don't even use the word ceremony. So, maybe watch a good show, read a book. I like stories.
Cool. What's one big lesson psychedelics have taught you?
It really is all one. Really, really. Yeah.
Who is one person, dead or living, that you would sit in ceremony with? Insert your different word for ceremony, of course.
Oh man.
Wait, I gotta ask. So what would you call, if it's not a 5-MeO DMT ceremony, what is it then?
I just refer to them as sessions back when I was working.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And
so who would you sit in session with?
God, if I could really get him, I would do Trump. I would totally do Trump. I would. Like, dude, we got some serious work to do. So if I could do that, I'd do it.
I would say pour him a big ass cup of ayahuasca first, and then send him to 5.
Yeah.
That'll be my protocol. And then finally, what's your secret to living epic?
Don't live your life according to what you think other people think. You gotta live from your own unconditional place of self-love and acceptance and self-actualization. That only you can do it, so you got to do it. And once you do it, that's what you're doing.
Right on. Martin Ball, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. How can people connect with you and your work, and where can they get your book?
Oh, they can get my books anywhere. Amazon, Apple Bookstore. You can get stuff at Audible. You can go to my Patreon shop and get full color PDF versions of my books at patreon.com/MartinWBall.
All right. Well, we'll have some of those links, some of the show notes. And again, thank you so much for being a part of our show. And thanks for listening, everyone. Remember, it's not the psychedelic, it's the integration.